G'day. Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project, episode 99. One away from the big 100. Now, you're probably thinking, podcast journey, number 100 is almost a big milestone, but 99 is just as important, just like the other 98 are just as important, filled with lots of good information. But before we get to that, some housekeeping, and I have to introduce my co-host, Kelly. Induce. What's that for?
Going into labour.
Wow. They use drugs for that, don't they? To induce.
I'd say so.
Induce. Yeah. Well, I have to introduce my co-host, Kelly Cortick. Kelly, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm just laughing because we've already tried to re-record this intro 4 times now, and then we're just going to let that one go.
Yeah, that one's okay. That one's all right. You know, I was thinking, because the socials have been growing, like the Instagram followers has been growing, I wonder how many people know what my name is, because I'm always introduced, because I always say co-host, and I'm obviously speaking to guests.
Do you want me to introduce you?
No, maybe you can introduce the next one.
Induce you or introduce?
No, you can introduce the next one.
Okay.
But I'm Blake, by the way. I'll introduce myself. But we have some housekeeping before we get to this episode, talking about I think the most important, well, you think it's the most important thing when you graduate. In my opinion, it was the most important thing. We're speaking about pain and how to manage painful, persistent problems. And we have 2 very knowledgeable guests from a very knowledgeable group, the NOI group, which is Neuro-Orthopedic Institute. And it was an interesting episode, to say the least. It was a very long episode, but I think a lot of the questions that we want to ask, we don't have the straightforward answer, and that's the idea of anything in healthcare, but it just gets you thinking about how you're trying to help the person in front of you.
Yeah, Luke and Brendan is the 2 people that we were lucky enough to have on. It was the 4 of us actually recording this podcast, and it was really good. It was great because it stimulated so much great discussion, and there was lots of different thoughts around pain and how we should be implementing it, and things that we need to be looking into from a research perspective, so that our understanding on how we can use pain education as an intervention could improve, or how we could, assess it to be more effective, perhaps. So I think it's a great episode, and I think everyone will get heaps out of it, as with the last 98 episodes.
Yeah, it's a concept and an idea that's certainly moving forward in the research and our understanding, but it doesn't really matter how far it moves with papers coming out and people talking about. You still can only seem to improve in the way in which you deal with it by just doing it numerous times. And I think of how I very first used to speak with people in my first few years of clinical practice to now, and it's almost as you get more experience, which sounds really odd and silly and stupid coming from someone that is gaining more experience. The more experience you have, the more it makes you realize how important that experience is, which sounds like something that someone would say if they have experience. So the people in their 10 and 15 and 20 year mark, I remember listening to them when I first started, and you think, oh yeah, I get it, experience is great. Like it definitely gives you more insight because you've potentially seen it before, but the research is where it's at, and I've probably got, as much clinical information as you, but as you understand and have these conversations more with people, you just realize how important it is to have had those conversations before.
Can you imagine what it's going to be like when we're like 70 still treating people, and we've just got like 50 years of experience under our belt?
Yeah, well, it makes me think of people like, Stu McGill is a good example, where people, tend to be quite harsh on him, and for good reason here and there between some of the things that he says, but he has, and he does have a lot of experience. He would have seen things that I have never seen, you have never seen, and he would have seen them multiple times. Like that has to count for something. Like I would love to see someone like that who has tried to stay up to date with the research and has put out lots of research and has spent lots of time with patients, just what they're like clinically. And I'd imagine they would be, which is what I've had, and that's been my experience, people like that are really just simple. And they don't try to do too much. They really just meet the person where they are, and they're just very simple with their explanations and their education, and it makes so much sense.
It's interesting though, because I think you can get derailed too far And I
Yes.
think that you do need to be, like, I think it's so important to be able to have conversations with mentors and people to challenge you. And I suppose the more experience you get, the less you've got people that are challenging you, perhaps. So maybe that's where the problem is.
Yeah, well, it's easy to fall back on, isn't it? You can easily just say, yeah, I've seen it plenty of times, and that's just not how it works. And, you know, we know there are so many problems with just using your memory or your experience to base your clinical decisions off. Not to say it's not important, but we know it's very different to a systematic review and someone saying, yeah, I've seen heel pain 300 times. I know what it's like, and I know what I do works. Well, you don't have any real way to justify that other than just your experience, and there's plenty of problems with memory recall. I'm currently reading the book, listening to the book again, Thinking Fast and Slow, and one of the things I was listening to yesterday is Daniel, who's the author, was saying that the ease at which you can recall information makes you believe the conclusion more. So as an example, and a really easy example is if you hear about a plane crash in the news and someone asks you how you feel about air safety, if that's in your recent memory, like, oh yeah, I saw that plane crash. Yeah, air safety must be a real problem. Or you think about it more, and we know that air safety is incredibly low and incredibly safe, but just because you've had that memory, you recall it really easy because you have recency bias, you jump to that conclusion a lot quicker. So I thought that was interesting. I really love that book. I recommend that to anyone that wants to learn just more about thinking and critically thinking and the problems in which we have with the way we all think.
That book, is that really thick, that book? Like, that's a really hard to digest book? Is that the one that I'm thinking of, or is it
It is hard to digest. I don't know how thick it is because the first time I read it was on Kindle and now I'm listening to it on Audible, but I think it's like maybe 13, 14 hours, which
wow, that is a long book.
Well, Barack Obama's book, 28 hours. I listened to that like 4 times.
Joe has been making his way through a book at work, and it's like this big chunk of a thing that's been sitting on the kitchen table for like months that he's been working his way through. And I think it might be that book, but I don't know.
Maybe it's
one of
good.
those ones. I think you've tried to read it before or have read it before, or it's even that book, but it's a thick one.
Yeah. So before we introduce Luke and Brendan, we wanted to talk about 2 studies that caught our eye this week. One is one that I spoke about at the recent Ripon event, which is pain neuroscience education and pathoanatomical education for Achilles tendinopathy combined with exercise. And if you take a group of people and you control the exercise, one group gets P&E, which is pain neuroscience education. The other group gets PAE, pathoanatomical education. Is there any difference in their outcomes at 10 weeks? And that's things like function and kinesiophobia and catastrophizing, their hop, their calf raise strength, all those kinds of things. And the other paper is the concurrent strength and endurance training in healthy adult females, a systematic review.
Yeah, I'm keen to hear about this one. That title just excites me. I might have to get you to send me that one, I think.
Yeah, it's really cool. One interesting, I guess we'll talk about that paper first. So it was a systematic review looking at strength and endurance training in healthy adult females and looking at relatively the same outcomes across the studies, but looking at things like, neuromuscular control, strength, and if there were any improvements in 1RM max and running economy and things like that.
Wait, are they comparing 2 things?
No, so it's a systematic review looking at studies that compare different things. So some were...
What are they trying to find out, though?
What are they trying to find out in the study?
Yeah.
So they're looking at people, say, as an example from 2 of the studies, one group gets exercise and they continue their running, whereas one group just runs, and they look at the difference over the 10 weeks.
Oh, so one gets strength training.
Yes, strength or endurance training. So I'm not going to go into because it's too much to explain, but as an example, one of the exercises in this one from the Barnes et al. 2013, one group got a 1RM leg press, 3 to 6 rep rep max test, and they looked at some other contraceptive stuff as well. I'm having an absolute
contraceptive stuff.
Yeah, I'm having an absolute shocker today. But I just talk about the conclusion because it looks like I'm going to, and ask your opinion on something, looks like I'm going to stuff this up quite a bit. But it is a really good study, and we'll have it tagged down in the show notes. But the maximum time was 12 weeks that they were looking for these effects, and out of, I think, 10 of the 12 studies, there was a statistically significant improvement in strength and endurance. Do you think that is a pretty standard period of time for someone to improve?
Strength.
Yeah.
No.
How long?
I think it's a decent amount of time. Well, I mean, I think you can get stronger over 12 weeks, yeah. I don't think... And I definitely think you can improve your endurance over 12 weeks. Like, think about what most training programs are leading up to a marathon or a half marathon. They're typically 12-week blocks. So I think that's enough time to do that.
Yeah.
Strength, I think, takes longer.
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah. But I think you would start to see some improvements over a 12-week period.
Yeah, and they did it like the first study here, the Johnson et al., which is a 97 study, and they only had 6 in the running group and 6 in the running and exercise group. But 3 times a week seems pretty feasible for people. But if you're running it at a high mileage, I wonder what the minimum and the maximum needs to be. And I guess most people say two sessions at a minimum, 3 to 4 sessions at a maximum, because it does start to affect your running. What do you think is a good broad recommendation for people to work into their week? If you were saying, if they were motivated, let's say they were motivated, they were understanding why they were going to do it, would you say
strength training?
Yeah.
I would usually recommend for a runner 2 to 3 strength sessions per week. I think 1 probably isn't quite enough, and I think anything more than 3 will start to interfere with their running, or they probably just won't want to, I would say, in the majority of runners that I see. Like, it's not something that majority of runners enjoy. If they do, go for it. I don't think it's going to interfere with your performance necessarily. I think it's just hard for people that work and have things outside of training to fit that all in.
Yeah, and do you think, when you say the 3 sessions is going to be interfering, are you saying that because for most runners they're going to be doing 2 speed sessions, say Tuesday, Thursday, and a long run, and if you have any more than that, you kind of start to impact on that? Like, where does the 3 number come from? Is that pure just from time? And if they want to be doing more running, you have to sacrifice running for a gym session usually?
Yeah, I think time, but I also think performance as well. So if you're trying to fit in 5 gym sessions a week, then I don't know how you're going to be recovering from the running on top of that as well. I think it just starts to eat into that overall training load and maybe starts to push into overreaching or overtraining if you're still trying to run, say, 5 or 6 times a week plus gym training, more than 3, so 4 or 5 times a week. I think that would be hard to balance. Unless you were, say, not working full time and you had all of the other hours to recover and implement really good sort of nutrition and sleeping strategies, but I'd say the majority of people don't do that.
Yeah, definitely.
What are your thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, it's good. I think I agree, because a lot of the research seems to suggest, or when they conduct the studies, they say they're either doing it 2 or 3 times. So a lot of the information that we give to people, basing that off the research, well, the researchers said we've had people do it for 12 weeks, 3 times a week, or have had people do it for 10 weeks and they've done it twice a week. So you seem to be able to get good adaptation. In other studies that are unrelated to runners, there's plenty of research to say that if you add more volume, you can increase your strength. And I'm thinking of one study that showed a maximum of kind of 40 to 50 sets per 40 to 50 working sets per muscle group is kind of somewhere near the upper limit of how much you can increase. So if you're doing, let's say, 15 sets of calf raises over the course of the week, you can increase that all the way up to 30 or 40 or 50 and still almost have similar gains in relation to how much you're increasing the volume.
50 sets.
Yeah, that's like the upper limit for strength. And of course, that's not talking, this isn't a running population. This is just in a trained gym going population of healthy males and females.
Sets of 10, 5 times a week.
Well, it's not about the repetitions, it's just the set. So I guess if they're controlling intensity. So if you say, I'm going to do a set with 3 reps in reserve, you could potentially say the intensity is going to be pretty difficult, whether you're doing 20 or 10. And if you're doing the volume, that's what you're controlling.
Okay.
That doesn't make sense to you?
Are you talking about sets or reps?
I'm talking about sets. I'm talking about, sets. Okay. What did I say?
Yeah, you said 50 sets a week.
Yeah, 40 to 50, it might be like the upper ceiling as you can do. So if you're doing 20 sets of calf raises, and that might be spread out and you're doing 5 Monday, 5 Wednesday, 5 Thursday, 5 Saturday, you can increase that up to 40 to 50. And obviously you wouldn't just jump from that per week, but you can increase it and still have the improvements rather than you increasing it and you're starting to hinder on your performance. So
still be hard to recover from that though.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And this is, I'm going to be clear, this isn't in the running population at all, but hearing something like that makes me think that potentially there may be some benefit in adding in more sessions and more volume, but breaking up the frequency. So almost, could you say, going to the gym 4 or 5 times a week, doing more volume, but splitting it up. Yeah, just for 20 minutes. So rather than doing, let's say 10 working sets over the course of the week in 2 sessions, which would be 5 and 5, you might do 20 and do it in maybe 3 or 5. So you're doing it 4 days, but then you have to, sacrifice more time.
I think it's just going to depend on the person in front of you. Like maybe for someone like
you,
that could work because you work at a gym. So you can, in your lunch break, you could go and do a quick 20-minute gym session. But I'd say the majority of people, like it's the whole getting there thing that is the hard part.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'm saying we're not like that's not. Yeah, we're not making that a part of it. Purely just looking at it like this is, the best case scenario.
And then also thinking about what the goal is of strength training for a runner. So, for me, my main goals is to make my tendons and bones stronger. That's what I like to get out of my strength training. And to do that, I kind of want to separate it from running. So then it almost has to be at a different point in the day from when I've just gone for a run, or make sure that I am recovered enough so that I can push the intensity hard enough. So like logistically, it's really hard to kind of fit in any more than 2 or 3 around a training week, I'd say, for those reasons. Yeah.
I wonder if a lot of the studies that look at strength training and running, and hopefully I'm going to be able to add to that plethora of research in the future, I wonder if it's somewhat to do with the intensity of just how much someone enjoys going into the gym. If you're a runner and you don't like squatting or deadlifting or doing a calf raise compared to, say, a bodybuilder, the level of intensity and intent you are going to have with each set is going to be different. Like I enjoy the gym, and I always have since I was 14 or 15. I like doing a heavy squat or a heavy calf raise to failure. Like it feels good. And I wonder if you were to take a person that doesn't enjoy it at all, that understood that they need to do it and it's good for them, if the intensity is so much lower. And we know intensity has a huge impact on hypertrophy and strength and magnitude of loading. So I wonder if that plays into the research as well, because you can say like, hey, yeah, push yourself hard, but it's different compared to say if you go out and run a threshold. They're like, yeah, I'm going to push my limit. They push harder than what they actually need to, probably.
I was literally going to talk about this today anyways, because last week I joined a gym instead of just training at work. And so normally when I train at work, I'm just in the work gym on my own, just with a few dumbbells and a barbell, and I'm just kind of making the most of it and kind of just going through the motions and not really loving it heaps. And last week I got into the gym for the first time in years and I was thriving. I had such a good time. I feel like I was just bouncing off the other people that were in there that were pushing themselves, and it was just different. Like it just made it a whole lot more enjoyable. I felt like there was a different kind of intensity that I haven't felt in a gym session for a while. And then the other thing is you can actually do things a lot better in the gym. So like the calf raises that I have been doing for the last 3 years have been either really wobbly using a barbell and I feel unbalanced and there's other things that are limiting how much I can push it, or I'm holding onto a dumbbell which doesn't feel quite heavy enough. And then going into the gym, I was able to actually do it well, like with good quality, and push the intensity and feel like I was getting out of it what I was putting in. And it just made such a big difference to me. And yeah, so I was completely thinking that, like, what have I even been achieving in the gym the last 2 years? Like, this just feels so much more purposeful, and I just felt like I got a lot more out of it.
And the other study, which was interesting, talking about, giving someone pain neuroscience education versus patho-anatomical education and following them over 10 weeks and seeing if you control the exercise, does one group have a better outcome? And it was such an interesting conclusion that, you would think that P&E potentially may have a better effect on things like pain-evoked movement, things like catastrophizing, kinesiophobia, potentially pain, and not so much on the other physiological measures like, your calf raise height and how many single leg hops you can do and how sore it is when you single leg hop. But there was no difference in the outcomes at all between either group. And an interesting conclusion from the researchers, and two of the researchers, Ebony Rare and Lauren Mosley, were on this paper saying potentially it's not the education, the education information, but it's just the fact of learning something new can have such an impact on people rather than the content of that, which I found interesting.
Both groups improved though. It wasn't that one was better than the other. It was they both improved.
Yeah, so no difference in the outcomes.
No difference.
Yeah, no difference in the outcomes. But yeah, and this is the conversation we were having at Ripon is what are going to be the long-term effects? Again, it's not to say that the other group was getting, harmful information, but you wonder if someone truly understands pain as being this multifaceted thing that we don't always understand, and we don't always relate to tissue damage or the things that you've done. Does that have any hopefully good effect on them in the long term, in the next 6 months or 12 months or however long it's going to be, if they are going to be experiencing pain again? And I don't know the answer to that, but that was the thing I think I wanted to hear everyone's opinion on. And we had some really good discussion, so it was a good thought, and something I continue to think about all the time is what I'm saying to someone right now and how you understand what's happening to your body. What is going to be the long-term impact of that? And hopefully if it's positive, they're going to have a positive experience the next time they have discomfort, which is almost inevitable, or potentially just be able to manage it better.
I suppose at the moment there's just an absence of evidence to support that. So it's things that they need to look into further. As you sort of said, they've looked into that particular idea in the low back and in the neck. And it does seem that that's the way of the sort of long-term outcome or the prognosis of that person is in pain neuroscience education. They seem to have a better long-term understanding of their pain and how to self-manage, and less kinesiophobia, opposed to when it is more of a biomedical explanation. But in that particular study that Blake was talking about, looking at the Achilles, there's just an absence of evidence at looking at the long-term outcome in that particular group of people.
Well, I'm not sure if they've done studies in this similar methods in the back and the neck. I know they've done studies where they've compared P&E and exercise versus just exercise. I know there's 5 RCTs between the neck and the back, and exercise and P&E was shown to have superior outcomes. But I don't know if they've done it. I'm sure they haven't
done like a long-term follow-up.
Well, not that I'm aware of. I'm sure that they have, and I'm not sure if they've done.
Then. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if they've done this kind of method either, where they've done kind of P&E and P&A and compared them, because like the rehab in this was awesome. Like, and you wonder if they had another group that didn't get any advice, just got their exercise, and what would happen there? Would they show? Because they measured all the right things, like the depression scale, the anxiety scale, kinesiophobia, catastrophizing, all these measures, and it's interesting to go through and see that there was like little difference, if any.
Well, the other thing that was picked up that we had a big discussion about was how important a strong therapeutic alliance was in getting better. So it kind of comes back to the roots of, learn to communicate, listen, shared decision making, make that person's, goals be understood, and and be confident in your treatment plan as well, where you can be, not in areas that you can't be, but that's where your patient is going to really hold on to that trust and believe that they're going to get better when you've got that strong therapeutic alliance.
Yeah, on that therapeutic alliance, how they measured that, they looked at they asked the participant 3 different questions. One was, do you feel like you are doing the right thing with your PT? Do you feel like you've got the right self-management strategies? And do you feel like you're working towards a goal? And the highest rating was 6, like strongly agree, versus 1, strongly disagree. And 2 of the answers were 6 and 1 was 5. So they concluded quite obviously that they had a strong therapeutic alliance. So maybe that was potentially the biggest factor. So kind of backtracking to the conclusion, it was almost, if you have that therapeutic alliance, it doesn't matter what you potentially tell someone, as long as it's new information and it helps them understand how to think about themselves, that's going to help them, but more to come on that, because that was only very, very short term. But that's a pretty cool study with some awesome researchers and such a cool idea. And they looked at everything. So compliance, they had 90%. I didn't actually explain this to you before, and I forgot to say it in the ribbon. When I was talking about the P&E group, they got videos, they got take-home stuff. They were going home and filling out multiple choice questions. They did short answers.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Yeah, but they got the explained pain book, was the other thing. That was part of the information. So they got really good digestible information, proven good digestible information. And so it was really cool. Such an awesome study design. And I think they had 30 in one group and 33 in the other. So it was good.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So we'll have both these studies tagged down in the show notes. But let's introduce our two guests from the NOI group. Kelly, you want to introduce?
Yeah, so we have Luke and Brendan who joined us. As mentioned, they are both from the Noigroup. So both from Adelaide, I think.
I think Brendan's from South Australia.
Melbourne.
No.
Luke was from Melbourne, sorry.
Yeah.
And Brendan's from Adelaide or South Australia. And Luke is now currently working in New York, which is really cool. So
cool.
He has brought the Noigroup across to, well, he's sort of leading the Noigroup in America or New York at the moment, and working a lot with the NBA and a lot of other sporting groups, and talking about how to sort of bring pain science into some of those sporting groups, which is awesome. And then Brendan is an exercise physiologist, so he's a part clinician, part researcher down in Adelaide. And involved with the Noigroup, doing a lot of research for them, which is really great. We talked a lot about some of the upcoming studies that he's involved in and where research really needs to go, so that we can start to understand the impact of pain education and how we can apply that to our patients better, which I think there's going to be some really great stuff coming out from him. So keep your eyes and ears peeled.
Yes, peeled open. And shout out to Meredy Lithgow as well. She is working with Luke over in New York. I really hope I pronounced her name correctly. She is an awesome researcher, so make sure to follow her work coming out in the podiatry space. So enjoy this episode with the NOI group, and we will speak to you all in a few weeks for episode 100. Cannot wait. Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project. Now, as always, I'm with my co-host Kelly, and we have two very special guests today. There's four of us on this call, which is going to be interesting. We have two lovely experts from the Neuro-Orthopedic Institute. We have Luke Gornio and Brendan Mouatt. Brendan's in Adelaide, and Luke, you're in New York. Is that right?
You're correct. Yep.
Over in New York. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us, guys.
You.
So you guys are both, which is awesome, East Coast. I guess you could say Adelaide is somewhat East Coast, but you guys are all from Australia. Where and how did you end up where you are currently? And can you speak a little bit to what NOI group is and kind of what you're trying to achieve?
Yep. I guess I can go. I'm originally from Melbourne, so I'm a physiotherapist, trained in Melbourne, 25 or plus years ago now, but I've lived in New York now for the last 23 years. And traditionally I was trained a lot in manual therapy, so I'm a very hands-on clinician, and I'm not a researcher, I'm still in clinical practice. But I guess over the course of the years and with evolution, I've just been drawn more into pain science. And now, I'm working at trying to bring pain science education, here in the US. It's been well established with Noigroup in Adelaide. Brendan's now in charge. But that's my role now is bringing it into, a traditionally biomedically focused world, a more biopsychosocial approach, from the everyday patient to professional sports. I'm working with the NBA now and different athletes. So it's really interesting working to try and communicate and translate that science into a clinical practice in digestible language. So, Brendan, you can add there.
Yeah, no worries, Luke. Yeah, so my background's as an exercise physiologist, so working clinically, and I still work clinically now, albeit very minimally. But I think that time in clinical practice was very much like a lot of reflection on, why are things helping some people and not helping others, and what, the difference between different strategies, and starting to engage more and more with reading research as a clinician, really was grounding for me, because a lot of my explanations and the mechanisms in which the way I thought things were working seemed to be very unlikely to be the real explanation. So I had, started to create this real curiosity around science and understanding more about what was helping people and how could I spend my time focusing more on that. So that led me back to engaging with research and going back and doing a master's of research. And so I moved from Melbourne to Adelaide so I could work with some incredible people like Tasha Stanton and Lorimer Mosley. And then on to, a PhD and so on. And so with that, doing education and really trying to translate that science, like Luke said, into practice and finding better ways to do that. And I think that's what, Noi really is about, is translating that research into practice, but also trying to navigate better ways that we can do that. So, different types of ways of communicating these really complex messages so that it is useful for clinicians in practice, but ultimately for the end user, the person suffering with pain or maybe experiencing pain in the future. And I think, at times there's some things that, I personally haven't got right with that translation of, what would be helpful. But I think that's one of the beautiful things about Noi is that we're really engaged with many different research groups, and that's expanding now as well, so that we can continue to find ways at improving that translation and finding ways to help people either understand on a clinician level or on a patient level to, better help their, serve their own health and quality of life.
Over the years, and I guess when you started practicing from when you went to university, and then over the several years, was there a point in your career where you just kind of had an epiphany and started to think like this? Or have you always, both of you, been people that really critically think and reflect from an early age in your professional career? Or was that taught at university? Or did you just get to a point where you were thinking these things aren't working, or the information that's currently out there doesn't seem to be right, or you were just wondering how people can be so sure of the mechanisms of how things are working? You thought, I need to investigate this, and now, to where you are. How did it kind of come to fruition for you, Brendan?
Yeah, great question. I was not naturally someone that was that critical, to be honest. I think as a student, particularly in my undergrads and even my clinical masters, I'd say to some extent was very much a call to authority. I was taking on what these, amazing professors and clinicians were telling me, but without too much critical appraisal. And it wasn't until I went to write my first continuing education course. So I was running clinical practices in Melbourne, and our team had grown to a certain size. And I thought, I really want to put together a continuing education course so that our team are consistent with our messaging and our practice to some extent, and so that they don't have to invest huge amounts in their continuing education like I had been. I was sort of really engaged in doing my Mackenzie credentialing and Mulligan courses and dry needling and taping and cupping and all of these different modalities essentially. And so when I was putting this course together, being an exercise physiologist, we usually spout this thing that we're evidence-based practitioners. And so I really wanted to go and find the evidence to support what I was doing, which is essentially confirmation bias, to say, this is what I'm doing. Let's just find the evidence to support that. And it was that process of putting that together that was really grounding, where it was as though I had never really questioned exactly the underpinning mechanisms of this. And that was what for me was game changing, was if I'm to put this course together and it to be truly evidence-based, that narrative has to change. And so that course was totally stunted, and I had to really reconcile why things were working for the ways I thought they were working. And I guess that was the turning point for me. That was that inflection point where I had to, eat a bit of humble pie and really go back to the drawing board to figure it out. I was confident that I was helping people, but it might not have been for the reasons that I thought it was, and that there might have also been some harms there that I was totally unaware of and oblivious to because of my understanding and what underpinned that.
And what about yourself, Luke?
Well, my humble pie started a little earlier than that. I remember in third year uni at Melbourne at St Vincent's Hospital. I was doing a Musk ortho placement there, and I nearly failed. We had this arrow system, and mine went backwards, and I was pulled up on my analysis. She said, "All right, Luke, you're nice with the patients and all, but your analysis basically sucks." And from that moment, I'm like, wait a minute, I always thought I was really good at analyzing, but I always started to practice. I worked in neuro and respiratory physio before I came over here just to get a job. So I've always looked or had an appreciation, I guess, for looking at the whole person and the whole being, looking at breathing, looking at neuro, working with head injury patients, and then putting that into a Musk orthopedic setting. I didn't start out being a sports physio, and that wasn't necessarily what I saw myself doing. I've just sort of fallen into it, in professional sports later in my career. And what I love about it is putting the whole piece of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So that sort of little time in the beginning of my career has helped. And the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, I was always more manually based, and I started a practice here in New York and used to bring Aussie physios just because I always felt they did a better job. So I had a lot of Aussies come over here, and they're not afraid to speak their mind. So one of them would always be like, "Luke, the bullshit you're telling your patients, this study here and this study." And I thought, wait a minute. I said, maybe I am. I'm talking about trigger points, and I wasn't keeping necessarily up to date with the evidence. And it just made me think, and I like that in a way, because the longer you practice, you think, well, what am I doing? You do question yourself. So having other physios sort of constantly challenge me and taking students, really forced me to evaluate how I was practicing. And that's when I got introduced more met David Butler, had a lovely dinner. He taught a course over here with his wife. And I just started really, I guess I was happy to be around Mosley and Butler and these people to really learn from them and start to think about, well, what really is going on here? And how does pain science, how does the brain, the central nervous system influence what someone's thinking, feeling, and experiencing in pain? So it's been a journey.
That's cool. We just sprung that question on you, and you both had like these very specific moments in time that were quite revolutionary to your career development and practice. So that's awesome. I feel like one of the more pivotal moments for me when in treating persistent pain patients was when one of my mentors, Dave Renfrew, said, someone that's in persistent pain is no different to any of the other people that you're treating. So why are you treating them differently? And this was after I had gone down this absolute wormhole and rabbit hole of learning more about explaining pain and pain education. And I would sit people down and try and, like we were saying off air, draw up the cup analogy and just expect that to cure all problems. And there was this moment where I was like, oh, these people aren't different. I need to be sort of just treating them exactly the same as I would treat anyone else. But let's start to bring in some concepts and change our language around how we are going to be navigating this together a little bit better. But that's probably one of the main things that I would see, or problems that I would see in pain management is that people might treat someone with persistent pain differently and try to go down a bit more of a structured, step-by-step lesson plan about understanding pain, when maybe we need to get better at just treating that human in front of us and the helping them understand their problem rather than pain as a concept. Could you comment on that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got to be better at sort of listening to that person's experience. And so whether or not it's acute or chronic, like that's just two variables. They've got a billion other variables that are going to be influencing their experience. And what gaps in knowledge might be beneficial to them, or sort of overcome certain barriers, are going to be completely different to the next person who has the exact same, they're at the same time period in their, their journey from an injury or from a scenario. And so I think we do need to be better at being able to listen, to hear their story first, to be able to validate where they're coming from, what their belief systems are, what are their social, cultural contexts in which they lie, and afford them the opportunity to sort of explore ideas and movements and their environment in different ways moving forward. So I think just assuming that the same core concepts of pain education are going to hit home for someone, I think that's really naive. And I think we've moved a long way away from that sort of approach now, with that very didactic approach. Whereas now it's very much, let's listen. Where are those gaps in knowledge? Are they open to more information or something? Are they curious? Or do we need to help them, create some curiosity first and have them invite us into that space to be able to start having that conversation, a shared conversation about what else might be going on, what other things might be helpful for us to start moving forward in this issue. I don't know what you'd like to add to that or argue on, Luke.
No. I agree with a lot of it. I think, it's a very interesting way to look at it. And I've been posed the same question. How do you treat these people differently? The idea is, well, you don't. They're a human being. And oftentimes they've been passed around from healthcare professional to healthcare professional, like an unpopular mother-in-law. They're not heard. They feel that their natural tendency is to be, I guess, feeling like they're almost alone or isolated. And pain, it can be quite isolating and lonely, and it questioning, am I making this up? And, to Brendan's point, really emphasizing that listening element. Maitland always said, if you listen to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong. And if you really listen to them, they'll tell you how to get them better. And I think that is really gold in patients with persistent pain, because I can come in with my biases, but really what that patient's looking for is help me make sense of what's going on. I don't want to feel like I'm making this up. That's not to say you don't challenge them, but you don't want to threaten them. It's very threatening when you're feeling isolated, and when they've usually been given conflicting opinions from different healthcare professionals. So just hearing them, giving them that emotional reassurance, validating those feelings without trying to pain-splain, as a word I've used, and give our opinions, can be really empowering for the patient.
Sorry.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Wanted to ask you both how you, in the consult and I guess for subsequent consults after, if someone's been suffering from persistent pain for a long time, and for clinicians listening and they're validating their feelings and trying to help them understand what is happening and what the likely prognosis is going to be, how are you measuring if it's been successful? And I'm thinking of examples of myself where you've spent a lot of time talking with someone and explaining things and going through different movements and perhaps giving them a little bit of take-home education to work on. But it's not a matter of they get up and they're like, yep, my pain's now a 6 instead of an 8, or they say the words of "thank you, I really understand what's happening to me." Sometimes it can feel like you go through multiple consults without seeing much improvement or seeing any kind of objective outcomes, which is very difficult when you're dealing with persistent pain. Do you guys have anything that you see or advice you would recommend for people that are doing these things but trying to see if it's really effective, or if it's helping, or if it's working?
Well, I think it depends on your goals of treatment. As I said, I'm still practicing quite hands-on. And that doesn't mean passive manual therapy, like we learn in skill. It's, almost using your hands as an educative tool. So sometimes I say touch to teach, like helping people move away from their focal point of pain and then noticing other parts of their body. And they'll start to say, oh yeah, my core is weak, or this or that. They'll start to usually negative talk about their body. And I might say, well, what's the strongest part? So I'll give them almost that somatic experience, or get them into their body. And then to Brendan's point, before I try and explain, what's going on with pain, I just start with, well, do you feel like you're guarding or protecting? And they'll say, yeah. So I'll say, well, think about pain as a defender or a protective response. And, the conversation usually becomes a little more organic from there.
Mm.
And then before they leave, I said, look, what I'd love, they might get up and say, I feel better. Usually when they feel heard, listened to, understood, and validated, they might feel their pain scale might have dropped. And I say, I feel better, but then tomorrow it might come back. And I said, well, I'm going to go and wash my hands. I'm going to give you a piece of pen and a paper. I want you to write down, what are your takeaways? Give me one or two takeaway messages. And they say, what do you want me to write? I say, whatever comes to your mind. It could be anything that we've discussed. And when I come back, we'll go through it, because I don't want you to just feel better in this moment. I want you to take it away. Or let's, now that I've got a bit more information, we can come up with a plan together. So I think just closing that session off can be a really, really valuable use of time, even if it's only 3 or 5 minutes.
That's cool. I like how you've done that too, because it almost invites the opportunity for them to bring up the fact that they might be guarding or protecting, opposed to us telling them that they're guarding and protecting, and then that almost puts up more resistance or more of a barrier. So that's a good communication strategy there. I think I'll take that away.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Like if in our own situations, right, if we come up with an idea, we're much more likely to be on board with that idea.
Yeah, for sure.
But if someone tells us an idea, it's especially if it doesn't align with our current belief system, which quite often it doesn't, we like to push back. We go, no, hang on a second, or at least we're a little bit more critical of it. So I think that's a really nice approach, Luke. If I'm just to add just a little bit to that, based on your question, Blake, I think there's a part right now where we are absolutely investigating pain education as an intervention, as sort of a treatment strategy, and we're looking at, how much can we change someone's pain with changing that knowledge, and I think that's great, and there's evidence to support it being a treatment and in and of itself. But I think one of the things that might be hindering us as clinicians is thinking about it in that kind of context, rather than being almost this conduit to help this person to make sense of their experience. Perhaps it helps them align their situation with certain valued goals in their life. Perhaps it gives them some control over physical activity, or the amount of discomfort they're willing to tolerate. Maybe it helps them improve their self-efficacy. One of hundreds of different variables that may be really, really influential. And I'd argue in the clinic, very rarely are we measuring a lot of those aspects there as well. So I think it's very much, yes, let's help someone or facilitate some of that sense making embedded and couched in a way that sort of Luke's maybe described, or that a clinician's comfortable doing for their personality type and the person sitting in front of them. But to measure the efficacy or effectiveness, rather, of your educational strategies with that individual based on just pain scores, or just regular outcome measures of other types, I think that might be slightly short-sighted. I think we can expect that there is an impact on those. But from a clinical perspective, I think we can go, all right, how do we get this person back towards meaningful activities, the things that value them? And quite often, if I'm wanting to understand whether or not what we've spoken about, or the education we've had has been helpful for them, I will explicitly ask that. And often in a follow-up session, it's like, we spoke about a lot last week, and I really want to understand what resonated with you. It's not that all of that would have been helpful. Can you talk me through, was that helpful? Do you remember what we spoke about?
That's good.
And being able to reflect with them and try and take out the, hey, it's not going to offend me if you don't, but it's an open discussion to really figure out what fits well for them and what doesn't. And that's quite often I'll send them a video or something like that after a session, and I'll be like, hey, here's a video, but I'd really like to understand what resonates with you about this video and what doesn't. So rather than going, hey, here's a video that I think is going to be helpful for you, it's let's invite a discussion about this and allow them the opportunity to explore that idea with curiosity in relation to themselves.
And doing that it's challenging, and I imagine that it slowly develops over time. And I'm certainly an example of someone that very much at the start. I remember, Kelly, you did the Explain Pain course, and we were discussing about it. And typically in my profession in podiatry, we've come from a very biomedical model and moving towards, I guess, where everybody else is. But, I was a big believer in biomechanics is everything. Biomechanics, or wrong biomechanics, is the cause of pain, and then slowly transitioning to what we're talking about today, and helping people understand where they are and where the likely long term is going to be. It just takes time to develop those communication skills for both of you. Has it been a long transition? I mean, I imagine when you first started to where you are now, things are very different. But for clinicians listening who, that sounds pretty challenging to be able to do, the only way really to become better at it or feel more comfortable is to do it more often. Do you have any advice for people that really find it quite challenging, but they know what they need to do, but are just worried about, getting it wrong or potentially making things worse? And I'll throw that to you, Luke.
I think I was telling someone, I said, spent the first 7 years of my career, 10 years almost, just honing in on hands-on skills, learning as much as I can, taking taping courses and hands-on courses and manip courses and all of those things. Then the next 10 years sort of saying, well, what am I actually doing? And that's learning about pain science. And then the last 5 years have been really communication, because like Brendan said, I've failed. I feel like I've failed many times, because I might be thinking, all right, I'm delivering a message. What the patient is hearing is, you're telling me that pain is in my head. So, what advice would I share is really try and get the patient's story, and nothing that's irrelevant, nothing that comes out of their mouth is irrelevant. Meaning, the more you hear and can make sense of their story, ask follow-up questions. If something doesn't make sense to you as a clinician, I would say, well, what do you mean by that? I might think about, here's what I think when I hear you say that, but can you tell me a little bit more about that issue or that stress or that other thing that's going on? And you might just get more valuable pieces of information that you can then use later on down the track to help them make sense of their story. So, I would firstly just say, don't be afraid. Oftentimes as a clinician, we think, we might lose the patient, or we might threaten them, or we mightn't. How do I handle a question? Or if they get emotional, how do I handle that? Well, I think you got to trust yourself as a clinician. You know more. I told a student once, I said, remember, you know more than the patient does. I said, but just trust that you can be fully present in the moment. So another way to help communicate is just, I've spent a bit more time not seeing quite as many patients, and just like before I go in, really just taking a few deep breaths myself, so I can be fully show up present for them. And even just my body language and my ability to do that can help steer the patient or the therapeutic interaction in a more positive light.
Yeah, I think the thing is, I think most clinicians probably have everything that they need already, and it's being sort of true to themselves. They don't need to go and emulate David Butler or emulate Luke or emulate anyone else that's, out there doing these incredible interactions with human beings. I think we all have our own style and what we're comfortable with, and that's really good. And we've also got all of these different modalities and skill sets and background as well. And it's not to say, they're all rubbish and useless, and that it's quite the opposite. It's really kind of embedding that in a way where you can kind of sit back and sit with that individual seeking your help and help facilitate change rather than trying to fix it. And I think if you're just going in with that sort of mindset of how can I create more curiosity for this individual and not take away the ownership of this situation, because I think we quite often go in with because we're good people, we want to take away this person's situation from them, but it's their situation, and I think we can really help them move forward with their life in a really nice way and facilitate that. So I don't think it's our role to take all of that experience away from them as well. So I think it's very much just changing that set of seeing with a bit of our own discomfort at times and affording that person seeking help the opportunity to explore the situation, to learn what they can that's appropriate for their situation and their life and moving forward, and when this issue might come up again in the future as well. All those opportunities there sort of sit there. And I think about things like, I was very biomechanically trained as well, Blake, and really about fixing those things. And often I would do this really intricate biomechanical focused program, exercise program, coupled with a bit of manual therapy and so on to really correct this movement pattern. And people would thrive. They would recover so quickly. Upon reflection, it may have not been the biomechanical variables that were as important in that clinical interaction as so many of the other things of me connecting with that individual, helping, supporting, and so on. And so now I very much view biomechanics as a biopsychosocial phenomena. People often go, biopsychosocial, we've moved too far away from the biomechanics. But I think if you think of it as a Venn diagram, as often it's illustrated, I would put biomechanics right in the middle of that Venn diagram, because we know social factors, we know psychological factors, and biological factors, of course, can all influence how we move. And to negate that is falling short with the way that we're interacting with that individual. Like our clinical interactions really need to reflect that biopsychosocial nature of movement.
I like that. It's teaching clinicians to be more patient, really, and more that helping by facilitating rather than fixing. I think it's like very clear that pain neuroscience encompasses a lot of different things, which would make it a very tricky thing to study and to compare in the research. I know there's some recent studies that have come out looking at biomedical models versus biopsychosocial models, and as we've already touched on, you're not sitting down with a person and explaining pain literally to them. So how is that studied, and particularly considering that person as a human and what's going to be most influencing them, their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions? Like, how would someone standardize that in a study, and how can that be? Is that a barrier to it showing up better in research?
It's a really good question. And I think a lot of research, given that limitation, has been all right, let's use a bit of a didactic approach and let's keep it really consistent and see if that's helpful. And we do see that it makes a difference compared to like a didactic sort of biomedical explanation for someone's pain as well. So, I mean, if you look at the recently published Resolve trial, They compared a complex intervention of pain science education coupled with sensory motor training, sort of graded into movement and more movement, versus a really compelling sham using laser treatments and fake brain stimulation and so on. So it was like, quite often we see poor comparisons between groups, but what we saw is both groups improved in their primary outcomes for pain, but the pain education group improved significantly more. So there was, I think, about 2.5 point improvement on a 11-point NRS scale or VAS scale for the pain education group, and that was about 1 point better than the mean of the control group as well. So we do see these kind of reasonable size effects from doing didactic sort of approaches to that education in that context as well. So there's something in that, but that's not the clinic as well. And I think that's something we need to recognize is, there looks to be power in helping people understand something to a better degree that's aligned with what they might need moving forward. But I think we can use our time better in the clinic, because often we've got time constraints like 20, 30-minute appointments, and we might not have those 12 sessions to work with someone. So being able to really hone in on what's important for them, giving them that permission to move, to explore the things that are safe for them, etc., is probably a better way forward. But you're right, it is really, really difficult to explore these complex interventions. But one other methodology that's probably a little bit more recent and in its infancy still being used is single case experimental designs. They're also known as SCEDs. And that's where we can be using individual people and really looking at, on an individual level, how they're responding to particular interventions, such as like a pain education sort of strategy. So we get sort of a baseline period of time where they're just doing whatever they've been doing, their usual stuff. And then we can kind of track quite regularly, their pain, their perceptions of fragility, perhaps their self-efficacy. And then we've got this one particular randomized point in time that intervention starts, where maybe it's a bit of pain education knowledge along the way. And then we can really look with a lot of granularity of what changes for that individual. So they become their own control in the study. And then you can have multiple people within that study, and it becomes quite powered. So you only need sort of 10, 12 people when you've actually got a reasonable power to that study as well. So we're kind of starting to look more and more in that or looking at those questions in that way with that methodology. So keep an eye out for some of that sort of stuff. That's really, really fascinating.
Is that recent? I actually haven't heard of them myself. Have been doing it for a while, or it's just kind of honed in more with the pain stuff recently?
Yeah, it's they've been doing it for a while, but not necessarily in the. Oh no, they've been doing it in pain, but really more around the fear side associated with pain. So Johan Vlaen has done some really interesting work in that space as well. So worth having a look at, because I think it's a nice methodology to kind of get to some of these questions that you guys are curious about.
Do you think as a whole, all professions, physio, chiro, physical therapy, do you think that we are like getting better as a whole at working with patients and helping them understand, with things like persistent pain and the incident increasing? What's your thoughts and opinions, and if not, why, and if so, kind of why as well? What do you think there, Luke, from a clinical point of view, and Brendan from a research point of view?
I mean, from a clinical point of view, I think it depends on the human being, the clinician, whether they're a physio, a chiro, a physical therapist, an osteopath. I think there are certain clinicians that seek to to learn and understand a little bit more, and that naturally just have that ability to communicate. I think it's hard to say, well, I look at the statistics and the data and I think, well, actually we're getting worse. And, I feel as Noi, we're a leader in this space, it's our responsibility to educate better. And that means also, I was teaching a course down in South America a few months ago, and we were talking about it's difficult to study this biopsychosocial approach, and there is conflicting things in literature. But I had everyone in the room say, well, where do you see yourself as a clinician? And I had a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very biomedical, 5 being very biopsychosocial. And I said, at the start of the career, where were you? And I'd get about 80% of them, or 85% stood in the biomedical range, myself included. And then a few stood in that biopsychosocial range. And then I said, right, after 10 years, where do you see yourself now? And a lot of the clinicians moved over to the very biopsychosocial, or closer to that, meaning they've got an appreciation for that biopsychosocial approach. Now, granted, these are clinicians that have signed up for an NOI group course, so that's the sample size we're using. But then I said to them, well, where do you think your patients are? And they said, their patients, well, they're over there. They're at the biomedical. So to highlight the point, what maybe we haven't done a great job of, or we need to do a better job of, even just when we're delivering courses, is recognizing, and this was to Brendan's point earlier, we need to tap into that biomedical model to start with maybe, and then guide the patient over to a biopsychosocial approach in order to improve our outcomes. Otherwise, it's like we're talking 2 different languages, and that can be really, while we're trying to educate the patient, from the patient's perspective, seen as a threat, and they might just go to another clinician, or that they don't feel comfortable with that. So I think, that's how I emphasize, well, in the old movie Cool Hand Luke, what we've got really is a failure to communicate. And if we could perhaps tap into some of those skills, and don't think, all right, this is a whole new way of treating. Like Brendan said, we already have skills and tools as clinicians, regardless of our discipline. And if you work better to get together to try and understand a little bit better, I think that's when we can start to really see some good outcomes. And these studies where N equals 1 can be really powerful case studies and be a platform for further research.
Yeah, I can definitely think of a few examples in my head straight away of patients that have been, nothing against chiropractors, but maybe long-term chiropractor attendees, and they, you're not even going to start to touch on sensitivity and other things that might be influencing their pain in that scenario, because I find them to be very, say, biomedically wired, I suppose, in terms of what might be happening to their pain. And then you might get the other person that comes in and they already are starting to touch on the fact that their neck pain's a bit worse when they're stressed, and you're like, okay, great, so this gives me an avenue to start to go down a little bit of that idea. Yeah. And then there's some patients where I feel as though I do a really good job of starting to touch on the fact that their pain is a bit more sensitive at the moment, because there's other things that might be going on, or because your body has been in that sort of protective mode for a while, and we need to sort of work on calming your system down. And there'll always be, well, not always, but every now and then you get that person who still makes the comment that they feel as though their pain is in their head. And I'm like, damn it, I've been working so hard on this and trying so hard to refine my language, but it does happen from time to time. And I use that often to reflect on how I'm explaining things and what I can do better there. But what would your thoughts be on that scenario? I'm sure that's happened before to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think one of the things in contemporary neuroscience is that we've learned so much about the brain and its role in the experience of pain, and it's important and it's wildly interesting. And I think over time, and I might be potentially, my own interpretation could be wrong here, but talking about pain being produced by the brain was a way of simplifying a complex topic to some extent. Biopsychosocial factors being influential for the experience of pain, and using the brain as something that pulls it all together. So it kind of unifies it in a way to move away from this brain or mind-body dualism, this Cartesian sort of way of thinking. And I think it did that. I think it made a big step towards that. But one of the unfortunate parts to that is that when we start talking about the brain to someone who has a very biomedical belief system, then it may be that we're just pushing the issue that they've got that they thought was in their knee or in their back to now it's a brain-based issue. It's just kind of moving that issue somewhere else. So although there might have been benefit sort of talking about the brain to that level at some point in time, and I think we still need to, but not necessarily with patients, rather than maybe we need to be kind of shifting away from talking about the brain to and their environment and so on as well.
Yeah, and I might just piggyback off that. I think of the bio too in the biopsychosocial as what's that? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think I might have become a little unstable.
Yeah.
Not mentally.
Sorry. All the talk about the brain. So I think of the bio piece as the biological mechanisms underpinning pain, and I'll shout out to Professor Mark Hutchinson, who's also in South Australia, who I've been fortunate to spend a lot of time with, and his group talk about the field of study of psychoneuroimmunology, and it can sound quite daunting. However, simply just having an appreciation of the links between the nervous system and the immune system and the role of glial cells can be really powerful. Just understanding that there's a link there can be a powerful way to explain to a patient that, well, this protective response isn't your brain. You can't think your way out of pain. It's your immune system has sort of reset a little bit, and it remembers dangers, or it remembers things, and you've got these immune cells in your amygdala in different parts of your brain, and they just light up automatically. So that can be a little bit more digestible, so the patient doesn't feel blamed, they don't feel stupid, and I'm like, sorry mate, you're a powerful individual, but your immune system's got you, and it's starting to make decisions on its own. It's got predictions, and there's a field of theory. Brendan knows a lot about it on predictive processing. Our reactions, what's happening in our body at any given moment in time, is based on a whole series of predictions, and our immune system is constantly trying to modulate itself. Another way to describe it is, people that have had the vaccines, we've got to be careful sometimes talking about that subject. It can be contentious, but just why do some people react more than others to specific traumas or cytotoxins? Because their immune systems behave differently. And that's independent. It's not their fault. And our job is to help them feel safer and perhaps give them positive movement experiences that can help literally rewire and modulate how much their immune system is reacting to a given stimulus.
It's interesting talking about the brain. I can't not just think back to the first time and learning about this. I cannot imagine how many brains I draw on the whiteboard. I'm like, yep, these are all the inputs, these are all the outputs. Great, we're done. Everything should be fine now. Take a picture of it and everything will be okay. And then when they're coming back going, oh, I don't know why they didn't understand that. So it's nice to hear that other people have made, some of those mistakes as well, and that I can grow and become a better clinician. How do you think on that topic, like things like movement and exercise seem to help? And I guess this topic at the moment is very interesting because it's very hard. I don't think anyone really has the answer how we know that exercise helps with lots of things, especially with pain and with movement and just helping someone generally. But what are the mechanisms and how we kind of think that is happening?
Mechanisms behind exercise. Look, Jared Powell wrote quite a nice paper around this and shoulder pain, and looking at sort of the mechanisms, and that maybe we need to move away from thinking that it's all maybe strength-based outcomes that are the most influential. So I think we're very much trained that, if we improve the strength, maybe the balance and activation of these certain muscles around this joint, that, that's what's going to lead to more superior outcomes. And regardless of extensive amounts of research, that doesn't look to be, the mediating variables. In fact, when we kind of do the mediation analyses, there looks like that may be a factor to some extent, but by no means is it a major factor. But there's probably a lot of other things going on for that individual that exercise can facilitate. And that might be things like confidence in body, that self-efficacy again. It could just be a plethora of other factors, or just a stimulus that allows that sort of neuroimmune system to sort of adapt and calm down and better self-regulate again, come back to that sort of allostatic state. And so it just calls into question a little bit of, what are our explanations that we provide to individuals about the rationales behind our exercise interventions, and when they do have improvement, what is it that may be helping them? And that might seem trivial a little bit. So like, why does it matter if they're getting better? And I think it really, really does matter, because I think that is, inevitably they're going to have pain again in the future of some shape or form. And they're probably going to have an injury at some point in time as well. And that interaction you have with them, if that sort of is a little bit sticky and helps them reframe what's going on in their body and what is helpful about exercise, may completely change the way they engage with their healthcare utilization, the way that they engage with their environment, and adopt healthy behaviors that we know align with better outcomes over time as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating area. And I think we're almost at the infancy of kind of really understanding the mechanisms of what's working when we are prescribing exercise or using exercise for someone. So I can imagine we're going to learn a bit more about what we can focus in on when we are prescribing.
What do you generally say to people when, they have pain in an area and you're encouraging them to move, although it is painful, and trying to help them understand that it is going to help their painful problem, but it's very likely that they have the thoughts that movement contributed to that. So it's almost like, well, why would I do that if it's sore? And then I'm not going to do it. It's just going to make it worse, and it's going to contribute to it later on. How are you kind of navigating that tricky conversation for both of you, especially you, Luke, being more clinical? I mean, I know you can't just say, yep, I say this every time and that's it and it works every time and it's making it about the person, but generally is it, talking about habituation and saying things, if we wait for it to be completely, pain-free, we'll probably never get back to the things we want to be able to get back to, or what are you finding is helpful?
Yeah, I think that it's a really challenging question, and it absolutely not a one size fits all. I think even just using the word exercise can already set someone up to be very guarded in their body. And so this is where, again, and giving the narrative, all right, just move. It's almost the patient's feeling, well, you're telling me I'm a wimp, or it's feeding into that. And what verbally might come out of their mouth is not matching what's happening in their body. And this is where your skills, your eyes, your ears, like noticing their body language, as well as what's coming out verbally, is really important, because they might agree with you and just try a movement, but you can see that they're resisting. And this is where I've learned over recent years to really go in and ask for that consent. Are you okay moving? And I may not say exercise, or do you think you could go this far? I'm not sure. I want you to be 100% sure. Do you think, oh yeah, I could do that? So you're basically getting them to set the parameters and they say, right, I'm not going to ask you to move too much, but what I am going to ask you to do is let's see if you can hold a position. And the cue that I'm going to give you is to breathe in and out. And they might say, oh, yeah, I tend to hold my breath. I said, well, movement, breathing is actual moving. Or someone that likes to do yoga, for example, they say, well, I can't do yoga anymore because of my arm. And I'll say, well, can you do Shavasana? You know, that the last movement in yoga where they're literally lying on their back. And they said, well, I could do that. And I said, well, let's break down yoga to what you can do and what you can't, as if that's something that you want to get back to. So 2 ways is, you know, asking for their permission and then placing that exercise into a meaningful task that's something that they want to get back to. And then as a clinician, having knowledge of what those movements are to help really enhance that therapeutic alliance. And that's generally the approach that I'll take, whatever level of athleticism that patient happens to be.
That's great advice. I just don't think I'll ever remember that yoga move, the way you pronounced it. I was following along with you said that. I was like,
I've got it wrong plenty of times.
Very
what
good.
about yourself, Brendan? What do you think?
Yeah, very similar. I think I do like to sort of explore a little bit of movement first and allow them the opportunity to show me what they're worried about, what they're concerned about. And I mean, we all do physical assessments, right? As a part of it. So it's generally obviously still with permission, but we can have a look at what's going on. And I'll often have them try it a few different ways. If they're happy to do that. And, you know, if it is different doing it anyways, have them sort of reflect on that and so on, trying to create a little bit of curiosity in any way, shape or form that I can. And then, you know, potentially at that point in time, maybe some education, if there's some gaps, if there's some curiosity, if there's some questions. But people do that differently. And I think there's some really nice tools out there, like David Butler's and Lorimer Mosley's Twin Peaks model that they created in the early Explain Pain books. I think they can be really lovely ways to help talk someone through pain. And so before sort of doing that, kind of gauging, like we spoke about earlier, is, you know, what is their understanding of that pain and what's that pain mean to them? I think asking questions to that effect are going to be really, really important. And if people kind of like, oh yeah, I know I'm not doing any damage from you know, when I experience pain, which I'm seeing more and more people that are like that, then I'm not going to go down that kind of route of, you know, telling them about pain and how it's different from tissue injury. That's just ridiculous. But they're like, oh yeah, I'm just worried that it's going to create more damage if I just keep pushing through that. And be like, all right, would you like to know a little bit more about that and why I might be asking you to work into some of that discomfort? And inevitably they say yes. If you phrase it in that kind of way and giving them the option to have a choice there. And then I think tools like the Twin Peaks model can be a really nice way to delineate that and have a shared conversation about, so how do you think we help improve or decrease this protective buffer that our body is, you know, experiencing right now? And, you know, quite often people are clever enough to kind of go, oh, that we kind of push into it a little bit, and that I'm still safe if I experience a bit of that pain into it. Like, perfect. So how much do you think we should be doing right now? What do you think we should do moving forward? Giving them that opportunity to start self-programming themselves and be like, well, I don't know. I'm like, how about we start with what you feel you can tolerate, and we'll just kind of monitor as we go. If there's someone who's prone to having flare-ups, just reframing that as, hey, there's a possibility that you might have a flare-up tomorrow. You know, how do you feel about that? I know that wouldn't be pleasant. And maybe we can reframe that as being really good quality information. It doesn't mean that we've done more damage, but it means that right now the load, that full biopsychosocial load of what we did that previous day or whatever the time frame beforehand often is for them, was just a little bit more than what they could handle at that point in time, and that we just scale it back a little bit. Great information to use, so we can scale it back a little bit, and then we're going to build up from there. And we're just going to continue doing that. If we have a flare up, we just use that for really good programming information and continue our way forward. And I think that can be really helpful. So that's something I'll always talk about is, if they're prone to flare-ups, is reframing that in that very first session as well, so that they don't just have a flare-up and go, that guy had no idea what he was talking about. I've got to go see someone else. He made me worse.
I have a question for you, Luke. You mentioned that you're doing a bit of work at the moment with the NBA, and you've been bringing some of the biopsychosocial models over to the States at the moment. What are some of the things that you've been incorporating into their training and their rehab, I suppose, and how has that changed from what was previously being given to them or provided to the NBA players?
Well, it's been sort of really the last 6 or 7 years. About 6 years ago, 2017, I worked with a pretty high profile case and persistent tendinopathy pain, and they had all the the treatment, as Blake mentioned, was very biomedically focused. I won't mention the team, but it's not that it was wrong. The player, I recently saw him, he said, oh yeah, they do all the Jill Cook stuff. Like even he knew, like a researcher. I thought, all right, well, the player wasn't an idiot and he was doing his own research. So what I've endeavored, I guess, to incorporate into the team is we have to remember the patient's still in the middle, particularly in the NBA. These are kinesthetic geniuses that have just been the best of the best wherever they've grown up. And you're talking about the best 450 players in the world. And to try and start questioning them on their body or telling them how to move or what they're thinking or feeling is incredibly arrogant from a health professional perspective in a way. Even if we've got the knowledge, in their opinion, they're like, how you don't know what it's like. They can't necessarily articulate it, meaning the patient or the athlete. I said, our job is to help them understand that we understand them. And I think I got encountered. There was a strength and conditioning coach from one of the teams, and he said, but we've never seen this. He should just be, we know that if we load the joint, the tendon, it will get better. I said, well, you're dealing with a human being around that tendon that's just not buying into it. And as long as that happens, you can load him all you like, and his pain can potentially get worse. Doesn't mean the tendon's going to be worse, but you're not going to get the best result. And his response was, well, we don't see this. I said, well, this is what happens in workers' comp. There's a fear of going back to the movement. If you chat to that player, he'll say, well, they're just trying to get me to be more productive. They're not respecting me. They'll want to, I went and played the playoffs for them last year. If I go back again, they'll want me to play more. And then I'm putting myself at risk of hurting myself. It's a contract year. I want to get another contract. So helping, I guess, the teams, and I'm writing a paper at the moment that's going to go out to all 30 teams, and it's looking at, again, the biological mechanisms between of these social factors and contextual factors that all influence a pain response. And there was a great paper written on looking at pro-inflammatory cytokines and social evaluative threat in high performance. I think it was for Navy SEALs, but there'd been some studies with athletes as well. And they showed that the moment someone felt under threat, if they took salivary cytokine markers, their inflammatory markers went up. And we know that inflammation and pain are related, that neuroimmune response. So, I could use those papers to say, well, look, this is not, the patient's not, the athlete here is not making it up. There's real inflammation. And again, there are a whole series of complex interactions that are happening. And, just showing empathy or understanding to that athlete in that moment can really help them model a course of action ahead in the same way I would with another patient, like we were saying before. Well, what do you think you can do? And how can we work together to bring the best you out of you. So
It's interesting seeing it come, between, as you're saying, like, the regular people coming into the clinic and then going through all the levels. It just says that, we're dealing with human beings, not just athletes and non-athletes, and they just get all the biomechanical massage and correcting their pronation, and that always helps. It's always human beings first.
Definitely.
And speaking about sorry, there you go.
I was going to say, especially at that level, because once they're at that level too, that they can't be human. They go out in the street, they're on social media, their bodies, that they're constantly being sort of scrutinized. So just to have that space to feel, oh, I can just be a human, is a really powerful thing for these athletes. Really important.
Speaking about the neuroimmune system, and you touched on it before, can you give a brief summary of kind of what that is and how it relates to pain?
Can I just butt in quickly? So after my Explain Pain course, that was the thing that exploded my brain during that entire course. I was like, whoa, this is the coolest thing ever. Like this interaction between the nervous system and the immune system, like, whoa. But then it was also very content heavy in that portion of the Explain Pain course. So it's something that I've spent since then 4 years trying to understand a little bit better and trying to work out how to incorporate that idea into treating patients and helping them understand their painful problems, because it's so relevant. And as you mentioned before, Luke, it is a really nice way to, I suppose, blend the two ideas together in a way that doesn't put them at fault or blame them in a way. So yeah, I'm very keen to talk about this.
Yeah. Look, I could relate to that. David Butler, I think, first mentioned it to me back in 2005. He was teaching a course in New York. He goes, oh, it's really exciting, this neuroimmune system. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? In a similar way, when I was back at uni and there was an instructor, Paul Liu, they called him Magic Hands. He said, can't you feel that? I said, I can't feel anything. I'll never be able to.
Where is it? Where is that?
Like, man, it's a stiff segment. Oh, my sweaty hands and everything. And I'm like, all right, there's something to this. And what is it? It simply means that so many things are happening. And again, I don't understand it as well. I defer to, Mark Hutchinson and the psychoneuroimmunology group. It's really, I encourage people to learn about it. There's a bit in Explain Pain Supercharged. But what I guess I understand about it is that we have these immune cells are laid out, and it's in a similar way. If you think about just touching a hot stove, you have immune cells in your amygdala and your hippocampus. Think about like your memory center and your emotion center. And this is these cells are then activated even if you were to see a hot stove again. So, we're getting sensory data happening all the time, things we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch. There was an example of a guy who'd cut his finger off in a bread factory, and even just the smell of bread would trigger a pain response. And people can relate to that. They say, oh yeah, actually, it's funny. Just thinking about that, I can actually feel my hand getting tighter. Or, that they mightn't feel pain, but they'll see a reaction. And that happens automatically. And it's again, I think just as a clinician, the more I've learned about it and the associations, they're called AMPs, associated molecular patterns, that responses or reactions that can increase sympathetic drive, elevate your heart rate, increase nociception and nociceptive pathways. So you start to be more sensitized, which then also affects your ability to have higher cognitive processing and reasoning. So if you see someone in that immune state or a defensive state and you go and try and start explaining pain to them, that might enhance that immune response because you're being seen as a threat. So this is where, again, all right, if I'm talking about this and I see in the patient's body them contracting, that's when I might just start doing some techniques in the moment. Well, are you okay with doing, say, some breathing techniques, slowing them down, and trying to get them to see how, again, all right, you can now get to you're getting the pain or the immune response down to a level where you can start thinking and moving again. So I mean, I've explained it in a clinical way, but the biology of it is that helping someone understand it can actually change what's happening, and their immune response. And there's a whole series of electro signals and ion channels are involved. There's a lot of complex science around that. I think, as a clinician learning, and I'm evidence of that, it takes a long time to understand it, but that doesn't mean it should take a long time before you can start introducing the concept to patients. And if they ask you more questions about it, you can say, look, think about it like, when you feel under threat, you ask a small child about pain. I say, well, there's pain if someone says something mean to you. That's hitting their amygdala. That's getting an emotional response. So kids can understand it. So hope I've answered it okay.
Brendan, do you have much to add to
that? There's a whole course based on this, and that only mildly scratches the surface. So yeah, look, to be honest, I think you've done a good job there, Luke. It is complex and really complex, and I think the only thing I'd add is we can add another layer to that with the endocrine system and its interaction with our nervous system as well, that neuroimmune endocrine interactions. And so it really does, the biology here really ties why biopsychosocial practice really does matter, and why our practice needs to, if it hasn't already, evolve to reflect that nature of our biology.
So, sorry, Lee, you go.
Sorry, just to add to that, just because I often, because I can get threatened when I hear, oh, it's complex, I'll just, put on the shelf for another day. And this is what I think a lot of clinicians deters clinicians. Just because something is complex, it doesn't mean we can follow a simple doesn't mean easy, but simple and clear approach to just having someone, just introducing the concept to a patient that, when you feel under threat, the more things that are happening, the more your immune system is active. That can be enough to help start the process of modulating their immune system. So just because it's not complex, don't be afraid to learn a little bit about it. And we're happy to answer any questions. But yeah, that's what I'd just add. Because the more we can do.
If we know it's so important, and I think this podcast has been a good example of that, and people want to learn more about it and understand it better, where can they go and what's kind of coming up? If people want to reach out to either of you or find, courses or Noigroup, what's the best way to get in contact? Can they just come knock on the front door and say, hey, I've got a couple of questions. Can you answer these for the next couple of hours? Where can people find you and at NOI, and what's kind of coming up in the next, several months and years?
So yeah, people are welcome to reach out to me. It's just Brendan, BRENDAN at Noigroup.com. So yeah, always happy to receive an email and simple questions, preferably. And yeah, in terms of what's coming up at Noi, we've got heaps on actually at the moment. But I think we've got an Explain Pain online where we'll dive into a lot of the topics that we've spoken about today. And that's coming up in May for Australian New Zealanders as well. So you can just jump on our website, noigroup.com, to learn more about that. If you do have any listeners in the US, we've got Laura Mosley heading over that way later in the year for some courses, and then we've got Ben Boyd, who is one of our US faculty. He's coming over here to Australia to do dates in Melbourne, Gold Coast, And I think Christchurch it is later in the year as well, with his bodily relearning, which is one of our new books, which is incredible. That really dives into a lot of this stuff as well.
Yeah, so Ben Boyd's a clinician here in the US, and he's used language that, as a clinician, it's tried to sort of blend that research. So a lot of the neuroimmune science is in it, and it's looking at neurodynamic testing, how we used to do upper limb tension tests and slump tests, but looking at it in a more from a more biopsychosocial approach. So even just suggesting to someone that we're going to lift your leg up, that can create this neuroendocrine immune response, which can limit their movement. So you might get different straight leg raise results based on the level of threat at the time of the test. So, and then, yeah, I'm working on more hands-on approaches to pain science education. So again, because I'm more trained in manual therapy, and a lot of people don't necessarily like to be told what to do. So, again, I adopt the approach of a more bottom-up, teaching how can we use our manual techniques, how can we use exercise in the clinic, how can we use the cueing that we use, the words that come out of our mouth, in a way that can challenge the patient to perhaps move beyond where they think they can, without threatening them to the point where they just freeze up and go somewhere else. So we're really trying to do a better job of creating more courses in that.
Yeah,
And I'm NOI group, if anyone wants to reach out, anyone in the States, happy to answer questions. I'm clearly passionate about this subject.
Yes. Yes, and we'll have everything tagged below in the show notes, but on your website, which is great. There's plenty of resources and updates with courses and information on there, which is great for people to go and check out.
Well, it's also such a rewarding feeling. And again, as a clinician, it's not just about what are we trying to do. We're trying to essentially biohack, for lack of a better word, someone's neuroimmune system to help them challenge their belief system, which is huge, right? So as a clinician, having gone through a little bit of the journey, it sounds like, Kelly, you have too, it's such a rewarding feeling to put yourself out there and then see a patient in front of you just have that aha moment, or just that. It's such a rewarding feeling. And, I can't emphasize that enough. It's just take the leap of faith. And if you challenge yourself, it's good.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for coming on, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Lovely. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you as
Blake.
well.
Cheers.